Hey everybody, and welcome to Ready Steady Play. Today I'm going to teach you the rules and setup for Spirit Island. Spirit Island's a cooperative game for 1 to 4 players from Fabled Nexus, which is Greater Than Games' sort of like hobby line. And the game involves all the players taking on the role of spirits and collaborating with the help of natives to defend an island from vicious invaders who are trying to settle there. Spirit Island takes an hour and a half to about 2 hours, but I'd say that's pretty optimistic, depending on how talkative your group are. The game's a pretty heavy cooperative strategy game. So let's talk a bit about the rules and how you set up the game. Here in the box, you've got the rulebook here. You've got 4 pieces of a modular island, and note that these are double-sided for what is called the base game and thematic island. We've got 4 bags of player colors consisting of a bunch of wooden tokens and 3 cardboard tokens. Here we've got little wooden tokens. These represent the Dehaan. We've got these plastic boil tokens. These are the Blight tokens in the game. We've got these Screaming Skull tokens. These are Fear tokens. And we've also got these little denominations here. These are Energy tokens, and they're a resource the spirits spend in the game. We've also got Explorers. These are little men. Towns, which the little men build. And cities, which the towns grow up into. We've got our terror level plaques here. There's one for terror level 2 and one for terror level 3. We've also got some plaques here. There's one wooden plaque used for England, an England build token, and a Swedish Ravage token. These are for the adversaries. Then we've got a bunch of player boards. These are spirit boards here. There's 8 of them, and they represent all the different spirits that you and your friends can play in the game. We should have one fear board. This is used for tracking things and looking at cards and whatnot. Whoo-wee, we've got a bunch of decks of cards. We've got major power cards and minor power cards. These are the powers that your spirits will be casting on the vicious invaders to try and drive them off the island. We've got a tiny deck of explore cards, and they come in levels 1, 2, and 3. These determine the behavior of the invaders attacking the island. We've also got a deck of fear cards. We've got a bunch of player aids. We've got 2 healthy island cards. We've got 4 cards for the 4 low-level complexity spirits. These are used for setting up the basic version of the game and help determine which powers you get in the basic version of the game. We've also got all of these spirit cards here, which are powers that the spirits start with based on what type of spirit they are. More spirit cards. We've got 3 adversaries. We've got Brandenburg, Prussia. We've got England, and we've got Sweden, and we've got England. You can add these to the game to make the invaders more vicious and follow sort of slightly different behaviors or give them different bonuses. We've also got 4 scenarios. Scenarios are sort of conditions that change the rules in a fundamental way, so I'll sort of explain what they do last once you understand how the actual game works. So with that in mind, let's set up a 3-player game. Now, even though I'm going to be setting up a 3-player game, I'll talk you through the differences between the 3-player, the 2-player, and the 4-player, and the 1-player. There's not really that many differences. In a 3-player game, we're going to take 3 of these islands and we're going to set them up in a specific way. Now, the rulebook will show us how to do that. It'll also tell us how to set up a 2-player game. The maps are here on page 6. But, I've played with the modular map set up in sort of any different way, and I think you can kind of make it up based on what you want to do. But maybe if you're playing for the first time or whatever, just follow what the rulebook says. So in a 2-player game, we're going to have a map that looks like... oh no, puzzle fails. It looks like that. There's our 2-player map. And our 3-player map is going to look like this. Cool. So there's our map for 3 players. This module can go back in the box. Now, it doesn't say that you have to use A, B, C, or D, so I guess you can pick whichever ones you want. The purpose of the base map that looks like this, with the sort of the kitty art on the lands, that's balanced. That's balanced for fair and sort of even gameplay. The thematic island, which is on the other side, which has this more complex adult artwork, it's more challenging because for a start, it's really difficult to tell what land types are what. And it's also less well balanced because it's more geographically correct. But it doesn't recommend you start with this because it is technically harder to play on. And there's a lot of ways the game gives you to scale the difficulty. And I'll talk a bit about that later on. Suffice to say that the thematic board, harder than the kitty board. So now that we've got our board set up, we'll put out our fear board. Oh, there it is. So in Spirit Island, you win the game by either destroying all the invaders or by scaring them off of the island. And these two goals are kind of interlinked because as you instill more and more fear into the invaders, the victory conditions get easier and easier. It starts out, you have to wipe them all out, but as you scare them, then the victory conditions reduce and you only have to destroy the towns and the cities, and finally the cities themselves. And if you scare them enough, you actually don't need to destroy their presence on the island at all. You literally just scare them away. So you can win by destroying enough stuff or by causing fear, but by causing enough fear. But if you cause some fear, then destroying the stuff gets easier. Now, there's various things that happen with the setup on the fear board. One of the important things to note is that these adversaries come with different setup rules as well. And these are going to affect the setup of the fear board. I'm going to set up a fear board here as though you're not using an adversary, because what do adversaries do? They make the AI more challenging and more difficult. They also have different levels with which you can scale the difficulty of your adversaries. But because, you probably don't want to introduce these till after you've played at least a game of Spirit Island, we'll talk about them later. So as fear manifests on the island, we're going to track it with fear tokens. That's our Screaming Skull bag here. Fear tokens, yeah. We're going to put out 4 into a fear pool here. 4 per player. Over the course of the game, the fear is going to trickle down here into the generated fear pool as we scare the islanders. When enough get down here, we'll get a fear card, and then the pool will reset. So let's set up the fear deck. We'll need these fear terror levels. The game is going to start on terror level 1, and on terror level 1, you're going to need to destroy all of the invaders in order to win. But we've got terror level 2 and terror level 3 here, and as these escalate, you need to destroy fewer invaders. If you cause enough terror, eventually you win the game here. So in a standard game, you deal out 3 fear cards here, put down terror level, 3 more fear cards, put down another terror level, and 3 more fear cards. Now, the number of fear cards in this pile will change based on the adversaries you're playing against, and might change as well based on the scenario you're playing. But in a standard game, it's 9 cards. This board also houses this Blight area here. This Blight area is where the Blight is going to sit for the game. This is the Blight here. Now, in your first game ever, you'll use this standard Blight card here. It says 5 Blight per player, so fill this up with 15 Blight for a 3-player game. Or, 1, or 5, 10, or 20, based on how many players you've got. But you'll put the Blight down here on the tile, and this will come out onto the island when certain conditions are met. And if the card ever runs out of Blight, the players lose the game. So that sucks. Now this base boards area here is only used in the basic game. So if we were playing our second or third game, we might take one of these 2 Healthy Island cards, which has 2 Blight per player on it, and we'd put this down here to replace the basic version. And when this area runs out of Blight, then the card is flipped over. And on the reverse of the Healthy Island card is a Blighted Island card, which is again filled up with Blight. And if that empties, the players lose the game. It also has a Blighted condition here, which makes the game harder for the players to play. Note that if a Healthy Island ever does become Blighted over the course of your game, you cannot return it to Healthy. Even if you get all the Blight off the island, which you can do by healing it, and back onto the card, it doesn't matter. And also remember, if the card ever gets exhausted, you lose the game. Now we're going to set up our Explorer deck. This tiny deck of cards controls the AI for the enemies you're going to be playing against during the game. The Explorer deck comes with 1 too many of each card, so 4 level 1s, 5 level 2s, and 6 level 3s. But you want 12 cards in the game, which means you shuffle each rank sacrifice one card, and then make a deck. And then when you're done setting up the deck, you just put it down here on the explore spot. So shuffle that and withdraw one. And finally rank 1. And that goes on top. Now when we're setting up the game, we'll reveal this card, and we'll use that in a minute when I'm putting out characters on the board. So our explore deck's set up. These are the cards we burned. Don't look at them, just get rid of them. And now we're going to put out some people on the board here. So you'll notice that each region of the board has tiny black symbols on it. These symbols can represent the Dehaan or its city. They might represent Blight like this one here. Or they might represent a town like this symbol here. So now we're going to start populating our boards here. We've got 3 boards made up of territories. There are 8 territories per board. And the territories are divided up into sand, jungle, mountains, and wetlands. There's also a coast on each board. And you'll note that each board has the exact same number of things on it, which is 5 Dehaan, a town, a city, and a blight. So the island is relatively peaceful at the start, but is going to get a lot more, how should we say, busy as the game progresses. And the game usually sort of takes place in like a wave with a lot of bad stuff happening in the early game as your spirits are weak. And then as they grow stronger over the course of the game, you'll find yourself driving back the enemy forces and sort of gaining ground and clearing the board up a bit. So in a 3-player game, you'll start with 15 Dehaan, 3 Blight, 3 cities, and 3 towns. But obviously this will vary based on the number of players that you're playing with. No explorers on the board yet, but we will put some on the board during setup in the very next thing that we do. So there we go. We've set up the basic population of our board. There is also a basic population on the thematic board, which we'll look at later. So now that we've set up our board here, we're going to perform an action for the invaders here, and that's going to be a generic explore action. So when the invaders take an explore action, we just take the top card of the deck, we flip it over, and that shows mountains. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our little explorers here and add 1 to every mountain region. This mountain card then goes into the build step, and that board is actually ready for the first phase of the game. So as promised, we've got some explorers appearing on the island. Perfect. So we've probably left the most exciting step of the setup until last, which is picking which spirit you're going to play. So let's have a look at these 8 spirits and decide what kind of divine wrath we're going to raid down on these invaders. The game comes with 8 different spirits that represent ancient beings that have lived on the island and sort of made a unstable truce with the Dehaan, sort of both respecting and fearing one another, but helping each other out in any way that they can to maintain this unstable equilibrium. There are 4 low-level spirits, and what I mean by that is, low complexity spirits. These are relatively easy ones to play, and the game recommends that you start by playing these. There are 4 of them. It then escalates up to moderate complexity, and there's 2 moderate complexity spirits there. And then high complexity, and you've got 2 high complexity spirits as well. On the spirit board here, you've got an image of the spirit itself. Its name up at the top here, and they all have really cool names like Vital Strength of the Earth. There's a little bit of backstory here as well, and then it'll tell you how to set up your presence at the beginning of the game. It'll also tell you what kind of playstyle this spirit has, and that'll help you get into the mindset for the game ahead. Then we've got the complexity level. Note that there's only 3. There's low like that. There's moderate like this one here. And then we've got high, like the bringer of dreams and nightmares. So he's a high complexity spirit there. Ooh. Finally, at the bottom here, you've got sort of a little indication of what the spirits are good at. And this will help you sort of pick spirits that kind of complement each other and help each other out. Although I guess in theory, you should be able to pick any spirits more or less for any game. I'll talk a bit more about what might influence your spirit choices later. If you're not using any adversaries or any scenarios or the thematic board, then you should be pretty much free to choose whichever ones you want, bearing in mind that some are more complicated than others, and some combo in more powerful ways than others, but we'll get into that in a little bit. If you are wondering what presence is, here is a player color, and here is the contents of my player baggies. We've got 3 wooden tokens like this with a defend icon on it and a little person icon. These are for when you use your powers and they influence the board. You can put these on the board to remind you of different things that are happening in different territories. Then we've got these tokens here. These wooden tokens represent your presence, and they'll go down on the board to represent which territories your spirit has presence in. And you can fill those up with any number of tokens. If there's 2, they get stacked on top of each other and they're called a sacred site. But more importantly, they're going to be coming off of your player board here and unlocking powers as you increase your presence on the island. I'll explain how that works later on. We've got here the other side of the player board, and on the other side of the player board you'll see things like growth, these 2 presence tracks here, and innate powers as well. And all of these kind of comprise the unique flavor of the spirit you're playing. We've also got a special rule down here as well, which sort of comes in and sort of increases that flavor. So I'll go over what all of this means in a minute, but the thing that we're really looking for here at the moment is the setup rules. So we've got put 3 of your presence on the starting board, 2 in the highest numbered mountain, and 1 in the highest numbered jungle. So it's worth noting here that it says your player board. That's right. Each player will pick one of the 3 boards I pointed out earlier and will choose which one is their starting board. They'll then put down their presence according to the setup rules on their spirit board here. So we've got 2 in the highest numbered mountain and 1 in the highest numbered jungle. Well, if this is our starting board right here, then we've got 2 presence right here in the number 8 mountain. There's a little 8 symbol here. All of the territories on each board are numbered 1 to 8 because there are 8 of them. And then we've got 1 in the highest numbered jungle, which is right here. So now that we've set up our spirit on the board, we can go ahead and set up our spirit mat. Now in order to set up your spirit mat, you've got your 3 tokens there of your color. And you'll take your presence tokens here and put them on every space to the leftmost on these tracks. These cover up the tracks. Later on, as you increase your presence on the island, you'll take the presence off of these tracks, putting it down on the island and unlocking bonuses, thus increasing the power of your spirit. Your spirit will also gain, if it's a basic game, one of these power tracks. This will tell you which powers you get from the power decks as you upgrade. Note that these are only used in the basic game, and in an advanced game you wouldn't use these at all, which is why there's only 1 for each of the low complexity spirits, and the 2 moderate and 2 high complexity spirits don't have them, because they're not used in the base game either. Regardless of whether you're playing the base game or not, you will gain 4 unique powers. These powers correspond to your spirit, and each spirit has 4 unique starting powers. And I'll go through how the powers work and what these cards mean later on. But once you've got your deck, your power tree if you're playing the basic game, and you've got your board set up, then your spirit is all ready to go. So now I've got my 3 spirits set up on the board, and you'll note that each has sort of presence on the map in a slightly different way, and this sort of reflects the different ways in which the 3 spirits play. I've set up here for Vital Strength of the Earth. I've got Shadows Flicker Like Flame, and River Surges in Sunlight. 3 pretty cool low complexity spirits. So if I was going to pick an adversary, I would do so now, but I'm not going to use an adversary in this game, so I won't set one up. But I will talk about them later. I'm also not going to use a scenario in this game, but I'll talk more about the scenarios later as well. For now, let's just cover the basics. But with this, we are ready to start the first round of the game. So we can see, according to this handy player aid, that the first phase of the game is the spirit phase. We can see, according to this handy player card, that the spirit phase consists of growth, gain energy, and then play and pay for power cards. During the growth step of the spirit phase, you can choose one of the sort of sets of actions here. We've got Shadows Flicker Like Flames board, and you can see there's little dividers here. So we can either reclaim cards and gain a power card, we can gain a power card and add a presence, we can add a presence, or gain 3 energy. As we saw during setup, Each spirit has a hand of these 4 power cards. Now these you'll play power cards each turn based on this track down here. So you can see that Shadows Flicker Like Flames can only play 1 card. However, as he puts his presence out on the board and this track is uncovered, we'll see that he can play more and more cards each turn, finally reaching the lofty heights of 5 cards. Each spirit will accelerate at different rates on this track, and some will never reach the lofty heights of 5 card plays per round. We have above this track got an energy track, and this is the amount of energy that Shadows Flicker Like Flames will get every turn. And energy is the currency you use to play powers. So having more energy helps you play more powerful powers. You can play sort of single very strong powers with 6 energy, or cheaper ones and play many of them if you've unlocked this track. But the point is that energy is also persistent, so having energy is always good, because it means that you'll always be able to play more cards next turn, maybe as they become available. Because when you burn through all the cards in your hand, whether that's your 4 starting cards, or you've bought more power cards later, or you've acquired more power cards later using these 2 sections here, eventually you'll run out of cards in hand. They'll all be discarded on the table somewhere where you finish playing them, and then you'll have to take this growth action here to reclaim the cards, picking them all back up and adding them all back to your hand. Gaining a power card. Gaining a power card in the basic version of the game means that you look at your power progression chart here and you just find the next power card, whether it is from the minor power deck or the major power deck, and simply add that card to your hand. If it is a major power, you will also have to burn a minor power from your hand, either discarding it under your board if it's one of your starting powers, or discarding it back to a minor power discard pool if it's a generic minor power. But that's only for the basic game, so you're probably only going to play through this once or twice, and then we'll get into how powers actually work in the main game. So in the main game, when you gain a power, instead of consulting your power progression chart, you just draw 4 cards off the top of the deck of powers. And you can choose whether you want a minor power or a major power, and in each case you'll draw 4 cards. However, it's worth noting that when you gain a major power, just like in the basic version of the game, you have to bury one of your minor powers. Again, if that's one of your starting minor powers here, you'll just put it under your player board, and it's gone for the rest of the game. You can never reacquire that. But if it's a minor power from the minor power deck, you'll put it face up in a discard pile, and eventually this deck might cycle, so you might be able to pick it up again later. But once you've drawn your 4 powers, you'll have a look through them. You'll pick the one you like the most, add it to your hand of powers, and it can be played this turn, and you'll discard the remainder to that face-up discard pile we spoke of. If you pick a growth option with gained energy on it, you'll just go into the energy pool, you'll take that much energy and just add it to your stash for later use. Now you'll still get your energy from the presence, however much that is, and also add that to your stash later on as well. If you choose gain to add a presence, then you take a presence from your mat here, you can choose which track to take it off of, and you'll add it to the game board. Now this number below is very important. This determines how far away you can place it. So Shadows Flicker Like Flames has 2 add presence growth options here. One has a range of 1 and one has a range of 3. And we can see the starting locations for Shadows are here and here. So a range of 1 means adjacent territories from either of these 2 locations. So in this case we could go here, or we could go here or here, 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 or here, or here. Now, it's worth noting that when you're placing presence, you can spread onto other players' boards. In fact, you'll probably have to, if you spread out across the map, you'll be trying to get close to each other and help each other out. The other growth option has range 3 on it, which means I just count up 3 territories, and that's where I can go. So Shadows Flicker Like Flames has got a pretty good range on those abilities. So now that we've taken our growth action, it's time for the second action of the spirit phase, which is gain energy. Now, if you remember, this is the energy track on our spirit board. That's this one here. So if you've uncovered an energy number here, you'll gain that much energy. For example, if my board looks like this, I would gain 3 energy at this juncture, in addition to any I gained during the growth step. The final section of the spirit phase is pay and play for power cards. Now, this is going to be the chunk of the spirit phase. In fact, this is going to be the chunk of the whole turn. This is where you play power cards from your hand and use them to influence the board. The power cards you play are going to be going off at different times and doing different things to help you out, but they're critically important, and so you're going to spend the vast majority of the game debating what you're going to do and thinking about what you're going to do and talking to your friends, unless you're playing alone, during this step of the game. Here we have the starting hand of Shadows Flicker Like Flames. Now, it's worth noting here that we've got 3 blue cards and 1 red card. Now, that's going to be a key consideration as we look through these cards. We can also see here that actually this is to do with the speed of the card, which is indicated here. These 3 are turtles, so they're blue, and this one is a bird. A lark, a starling, a swallow, who knows, but that's fast, and so it's red. If we refer ourselves back to our turn order thing here, you can see it says here Spirit Phase, which is what we're doing now. Then it has fast powers, which means as soon as we're done playing all of our cards here and paying for them, we're then going to have the fast phase. So all those fast red Sparrow cards we played will happen now. Then it's the Invader phase. The Invaders are going to do a whole bunch of stuff, like ravage the land and create blight, build more buildings and send out more explorers. It's going to be a complete drag, and by the end of it, you're not going to like the situation on the island. Then, after all of that has taken place, we're going to have the slow power cards we played way back up here in the Spirit phase coming into effect. Those are our blue ones with the tortoise on them. Then finally, time passes in the end phase, and this is just kind of a cleanup where you take any tokens you played on the board, take them away, and anyone who was damaged but wasn't killed is also healed during the time passes phase. Note that spirits are never damaged. They can't be killed that way. So this damage is referring to damage to invaders and also damage to Dehaan on the board. But now back to the Spirit phase. So here in the Spirit phase, we've got to think about these power cards we're playing. Well, what does a power card do? Power cards can do basically anything, from generating fear to putting damage out on the board, which will take invaders off the board. It will also allow you to move things around the board. This can be Dehaan, it can be invaders. These also have elements called gather. Gather is when you pull things like Dehaan or invaders from adjacent territories into a territory. And it's also got push, where you push things out of a territory into adjacent territories. So you can see here we've got fast power called Concealing Shadows. This has got a range of 0. That means it can only be cast in territories where the spirit using it is present. It's also got target land any, which means you can target any of these territories here, these lands on the board. And finally it says after you've done that, you will do as much of this as possible. So in this case it says 1 fear, so we would generate a fear. I'll talk about that in a minute. It also says Dehaan take no damage from raging invaders this turn. So during the Raging Invaders step, the Invaders and the Dehaan would fight, but this makes them immune to damage. In this case, I would grab my little token here. This is a reference. This is a reference to remind me of the power, and I would put this down in the territory where I used it. We've also got a slow power here. Now, this slow power has a cost of 1. So that means we've got to take one of those bright energy tokens we got earlier, return it to the bank to pay for this. So we would pay that energy back to the bank. We would play this slow card in the Spirit phase, and then it would do nothing. It would do nothing until after the Invader phase. Note that elements that are on these cards, again, very important, and I'll talk about those in a minute, but elements are added to the pool the minute the card is played, not the minute the effects come into play. So all elements are available in the Spirit phase, even though the cards will not activate till either the fast phase or the slow phase. So here we've got our speed slow. Range on this appears to be infinite. And then it says target any spirit. Well, that's why the range is infinite, because you're targeting a spirit. Any means any spirit. Some of these say other spirits, things like that. Sometimes you can target any spirit other than yourself. So again, we would gain 2 fear here, which is great. It also says target spirit may push 1 explorer and 1 town from one of their lands. So if he'd cast this on, for example, Vital Strength of the Earth, then Vital Strength of the Earth could push this explorer here out of his territory. He can't use it here because there's nothing in it. And he could push it into one of these 3 adjacent territories here. And the advantage of that, well, you'll discover during the Invader phase. Every spirit also has at least 1 innate power. Some have more than 1. The innate power also has tiers. And this is also played during the spirit phase before the powers go off and the invader phase kicks in. And you can see it looks much like a card power. This one's called Darkness Swallows the Unwary. We can see here it's a fast power. We can see here that it has a range 1 and it's next to this strange symbol here. Well, what does that mean? Well, that strange symbol is a sacred site. We talked about this very briefly earlier, but a sacred site is when you have 2 presence in 1 territory. For example, if we look at Shadows Flicker Like Flames here, we can see this is a sacred site because there are 2 presence. That's why they're stacked on top of each other. Note that Shadows can still put more presence in this territory, but you can't really get better than a sacred site. Here's a territory where he's got 1 presence, so he is present here, but it's not a sacred site. So we can see here that Darkness Swallows the Unwary has a range of 1 from any sacred site, so it can be used in any territory that is adjacent to a sacred site or the sacred site territory itself. It also says target land any. This could specify different land types, stuff like that. It could say, for example, wetlands or mountains. It could also say lands where Dehaan or invaders are present, or indeed where they're not present. And we can see down here, Tier 1 is 2 moons and a fire. It says gather and explore. Then Tier 2 says destroy up to 2 explorers, 1 fear per explorer destroyed in this way. And then we've got 3 damage here, 1 fear per invader destroyed by this damage. Now these are cumulative, which means that if we pay for this top tier here, we get all of the bottom tiers as well. Because the thing about these element symbols is they're not a finite resource. That is to say, if you have 2 moons and a fire, you'll always have 2 moons and a fire. If you have 4 moons, 3 fire, and 2 feathers, you can pay for all 3 of these things, but you do have to go through them in order. How do we get these symbols? Well, it's very simple. When you pay a power card from your hand in the spirit phase, then no matter whether it's slow or fast, you automatically add those elemental symbols on the card to your elemental symbol pool, which is simply just counting up all the symbols on the card. There's no tokens or anything for this. You just look at the cards you've played, you count up the symbols. If you've got enough symbols to match a power, you can cast it. If you have 2 powers that use the same symbols, then you can cast them both. There's no harm in that. For example, if we look at Spread of Rampant Green here, we can see he has 2 innate powers, and they both share a lot of the same symbols. So he could spend, if he had 5 green grass, he could do, and the other requisite elements, he could do both of these powers. He doesn't need 9, he just needs 5, because these elements are not spent, they're just kind of unlocked. And then he can use his powers in the same way that Shadows Flicker Like Flame was using his. Although it's worth noting that there is some difference in the text here. It says defend 2, instead defend 4. That just means that this tier replaces that tier. And then it has also, which means you do that in addition to having this one here. So you would decide to play your innate power in the spirit phase, and then you would set it off during the fast power step, or indeed during the slow power step if it was a slow power. To clarify, you can only utilize element symbols on the power cards you've played that round. When those cards are discarded, you no longer possess the element symbols. So after you've chosen which powers you're going to play, and everybody else has chosen their powers, and you've all argued it ceaselessly about it, then we go straight into the fast power step. So this is where all of the fast powers you played in the power step of the spirit phase would trigger, and they would happen. This also includes, as you can see here, innate powers. And then once we've done the fast powers, we go straight into the invader phase. Blighted Isle effect. So if you remember, this is the healthy card we put out. If you're playing the basic game, you'll just be using this Blight here. Now, this doesn't have a Blighted Isle effect because it's just for the basic game. And so the only thing this does is if all the Blight's taken off it, the players lose the game. However, if this healthy island has all 4 Blight taken off of it during the course of the game, then it becomes a Blighted Isle. Now remember, it doesn't matter if you can get all this Blight back on it from the board, it won't ever go back to being a healthy island. You're stuck with a Blighted Island forever once it's blighted. Now, it's also worth noting that when this turns over, it says put 5 Blight on it per player. I'm not going to put the Blight out, but you'd then have 5, 10, 15, 20 Blight based on the number of players. And it says any Blight removed from the board returns here. And if there is ever no Blight here, the players lose the game. This is a pretty common way to lose the game. I'll explain how Blight works when I get to the Ravage step in a minute. But it also says down here, downward spiral. At the start of each invader phase, each spirit destroys one of their presence. So this is a blighted effect that's going to come in when the Blighted Isle card is on display. And it just means, and this is the blight effect to which our invader step is referring. So when it says blight effects, this is the effect. There's 2 of these cards and both effects are just slightly different. When a spirit has to destroy a presence, it simply removes a presence from the board. It could be 1/2 of a sacred site, or indeed just one lone presence. Destroyed presence is placed down next to your player board, and unless you've got a specific power, that presence is then lost to you forever. It's not returned to your player board. It's just set down here next to it. So you can't lose these enhancements you've made by placing your presence. So after the Blighted Isle effect, we've got the fear effects. Now, if you've earned any fear cards, this is where you would play them. How do you earn a fear card? Well, you remember all those powers we were playing earlier that were generating fear? That's how you earn fear cards. Every time a fear is generated, you take 1 fear from the pool up here and move it down to the generated fear box. Get all of the fear from the pool into the generated fear pool here, and it resets. You take a card off the fear deck and put it down here into the earned fear cards pool. And at this step during the invader phase, all of the earned fear cards in the pool are flipped over. You correlate the card to the correct terror level. In this case, you can see we've still got terror level 2 and 3, so you must be terror level 1. And so because we're terror level 1, we look at the top of the card, which says each player removes 1 explorer from an inland land. And that is the fear effect to which the player reference is referring. And so once this fear effect is resolved, we can move on to the next step of the invader phase. Note that this would be resolved for all of the fear cards here, at which point the fear cards are moved into the discard pile. Remember that when enough fear cards are earned and you unlock a terror level, that terror level is immediately put on top of the previous terror level, replacing it. If you have generated enough fear cards to unlock a terror level and you have any left here in the earned terror cards pool, when these are flipped over, they are, even though they were earned during terror level 1, they count at the current terror level, which is now terror level 2. Also remember that if you can get all the way through this deck to the bottom, then you win the game. So now that we've learned about Blighted Isle effects and fear effects, we're into Ravage step. In the game, invaders are going to do 3 things every turn. They're going to ravage the island, then they're going to build things on the island, then they're going to explore the island. So the cards move down the track in this direction, but the actions move up the track in this direction. Now, because this is the first turn of the game, we aren't actually going to have any ravaging, but I'm going to progress the cards 1 turn to carry out this effect. So, ravaging. When invaders ravage, you look at the invaders in the space. In this case, we've just got explorers in our mountain, and explorers do 1 damage. How do we know? Well, it's actually very simple. Explorers, the most basic of the invader units, come back here, have 1 hit point and do 1 damage. Towns, which are the next level of invader unit, do 2 damage and have 2 hit points. Finally, you've got cities, which are the most advanced invader development, and these have 3 hit points and do 3 damage. Pretty easy. 1, 2, 3. So we can have a look here and see that this man does 1 damage. Now, when he ravages here in this land, he's going to do 1 damage. The Dehaan are strength 2, like a town, so they have 2 hit points and 2 damage. When the Dehaan take a damage, they flip over like that. He's now taken 1 damage. It's not enough to kill him, so he strikes back doing 2 damage, which is enough to kill the explorer who's removed from the board. 1 damage is meaningless. The real problem is where you get 2 damage. Now, if we look up here in this territory, we've got a city and an explorer. That's 4 damage. Now, whenever they deal 2 damage to a land, we put down a blight token. Now, note that this is conditional. So, less than 2 damage, no blight token. 2 or more damage, blight token. Doesn't matter how much more you have. You could take 9 damage to a land. It doesn't matter. It's either 1 blight token or no blight tokens. So they will do a blight here. Now this is bad news because this is how you lose the game. Remember, if they get all the blight out on the board, then the players lose the game. Blight operates just like diseases from Pandemic in the sense that it's got an outbreak mechanic. In this game it's called a cascade. If blight is caused in a land where a cascade would happen, well, let's have a look here. This city is going to ravage. That does 3 damage. 3 damage kills the Dehaan, who who are now dead and can't strike back. Now, because 3 damage was dealt, there's going to be a Blight here. But there's already a Blight, so that means that Blight is placed in every adjacent land to the one that would have had the Blight. So this is called a cascade, and you'd put down a Blight in every adjacent land. If you came across a land that already had a Blight in it, that would cause another cascade, so then you would go into every adjacent land to that. And so this would continue in effect, continuing to cause cascades until you'd put every Blight down that was required, or indeed until you'd run out of Blight and the players lost the game. If you've got too much Blight on the board and the Blight starts to cascade, this is a very quick and easy way to lose the game, so you want to be really careful of that. I'm going to be here tomorrow playing the game, and you'll see in the game, certainly as it progresses, I am pretty obsessive about keeping Blight off of the board. Invaders themselves have no actual way of causing you to lose the game. Now this changes as you vary the rules with adversaries and scenarios, but in the basic game like this, the only way for you to actually lose the game is by having too much Blight come out, or by having this Invader deck run out. If this Invader deck runs out of cards and you go to flip one over for Explore and there isn't one there, the spirits lose the game. So Blight loses you the game, running out of Explore cards loses you the game. If there are territories on the board here that are packed full of invaders, just fit to bursting with invaders, doesn't actually matter so long as you can keep the Blight out of those lands. The problem is when you've got so many invaders that you can't deal with them and Blight cascades become inevitable. So that was Ravage. Let's move on to Build. The Build step is where invaders build towns and cities. No explorers appear in this phase. So we've got here our jungle card, and we're going to look out across the board here and look at all of our jungles. So this is pretty basic. We've got an explorer up here by himself, so an explorer always builds a town. Here we've got a town by itself. Now a town builds a city. That makes sense, right? Here we've got an explorer and a town, so they build a city. That's great. Now here we've got a city. Now what does a city build if a city can't build the next thing, because there isn't one? Well, it doesn't actually build another city. In the case where there is a city, it builds a town. Now here we've got a town, so it builds a city. But the rule is that if we build a city here, now we would look at this and we'd go, well, if they were to build again, we would actually build a town. And the reason for that is that a town will build, you always build a city if there are more towns than cities. But if there are not, then you build a town. So in the case of a single town, there's more towns than cities, we build a city. Now there's a city and a town, so we build another town. Next turn, there'd be more towns than cities, we'd build another city. So on and so forth. You know, creating an equilibrium of towns and cities spreading out across the board like a bad people disease. So our third and final act in the Invader step is Explore. So we flip this card over here. We see what land type we're exploring. In this case, it's Wetlands. So now if you remember from the setup, we actually already did an Explore action in the mountains during setup. But now we're going to do another one in the Wetlands. And what happens in this is we simply put down Explorers. Now, we do check when placing Explorers for Adjacency. So Explorers can only explore if they've got somewhere to come from. In this case, the coast is the starting one. They can always come from the coast. So any wetlands adjacent to the coast automatically get an Explorer. The second rule is that they can appear in territories that are adjacent to territories containing towns or cities. So in this case, it's actually all of our territories, because we've got a town here. And this one here actually has a town in it. But in the instance of more maybe a Sparser island, or the spirits have destroyed more things, you might find like sort of inland territories which are not next to coast and not next to towns, in which case you wouldn't put an Explorer down. So after all that's done, the Ravage card is discarded. The Build card becomes next turn's Ravage card. Our Explore card becomes next turn's Build card. And our Explore deck sits there waiting to be revealed during the next Invader step. And that's the end of the Invader step. The savvy of you will remember that after the Invader step, the slow powers activate. So this is where you would activate any cards or innate powers that you play during the Spirit phase. So you will have already had to play them. But they're slow, so they only activate now at this point. This is both a pro and a con, because it means that you can't prevent those invaders who were in these different areas from doing anything. For example, if you wanted to push them around to prevent them from building, like if they're going to build in the mountains and you wanted to push them out of the mountains to stop them from building, well, you'd need to play a fast power, because otherwise they would just build during this phase. But if you wanted to destroy towns and cities, you might use a slow power to destroy the towns or cities they've just built. So pros and cons to that. But then we go over to time passes. Now this is where anyone who's damaged is healed. We can see, looking at this tableau, that our Dehaan here is on 1 health. This Dehaan is on 2. This city is on 1 health. We can tell because it's got a single building up. And this town is also on 1 health. If this city looked like that, that means it's on 2 health. If the city looks like that, that means it's on 3 health and it's completely healthy. Towns have 2 health, so there's 1 health and there's 2 health. You can also put them down like that. I guess it's up to you how you want to do it. But anyone who'd taken damage during the phase would, during the time fastest step, be healed back up to full. And then we'd be ready to go back to the spirit phase and continue this whole engine over again. And that's pretty much it for the basic game of Spirit Island. I mean, I know it seems simple, but a lot of the complexity comes with these power cards and the way they interwork with one another, and the way you can help them out. You'll get a lot of power cards that say target any spirit, or target a spirit other than yourself. You'll have to talk to your friends, find out what they're trying to do, see if you can help them in any way, see if they can help you in any way. You'll be identifying on the board the areas that are going to be causing the most problems for you now or in the future perhaps, and making sure you deal with those problems in the immediacy. Remembering all the while that you've got to progress those fear cards and generate fear in order to reduce the victory conditions and have a chance of winning the game. It's also worth noting that any cities that are destroyed by a power or by a ravage action, any cities that are removed from the board because they were destroyed. Note that destroyed is distinct from remove. But anything destroyed, if it's a city, you gain 2 fear for that, so that'll come out of the fear pool and go into the generated fear pool. And towns cause the destruction of towns generate 1 fear, so that gets you 1 fear. But the explorers, well, nobody cares about them. If they die, then there's no bonus for you. You've just killed the explorer, which might be a bonus in of itself. It's destruction of explorers is its own reward. Remember that when you're doing your growth step, if you do gain a major power, in a standard game, you'll draw 4 major powers. You'll pick 1 to keep, and the other 3 will go into a major power discard pile. Now, because you've kept 1, that means you're going to have to sacrifice 1 of your minor powers. If it's 1 of your spirit powers, your unique spirit powers, that's buried under your player map. And if it's a minor power that you've already grabbed over the course of the game, that's just discarded to the pool here. Major powers look slightly different to minor powers in that they're typically a lot more expensive. They do generate elements just the same. They've got a speed, a range, and a target land just the same. You've got your effects down here, typically better than your minor powers. For example, here we've got Talons of Lightning, and they do 3 fear and 5 damage. We've also got down here a gated additional effect. So this says if you have 3 fire and 3 feathers, then you may destroy 1 town in each adjacent land and increase the power's range to 3. Well, that's great, because this actually generates a fire and a feather, so you only need 2 more of each. And if you have that when you play the card, then you will gain this boon. It's worth noting that, as I said before, these elements are not resources that are exhausted, so you could use the same 3 fire and 3 feathers to then go on and, say, cast one of your innate powers, like Tier 4 Darkness Swallows the Unwary, provided you have the moons. So is that it? Is that the whole thing, I hear you say? Well, yeah, pretty much, actually, that is it. Like I said, the complexity of the game comes in from playing the power cards. There are ways to make it more difficult. For example, you can activate the geologically more accurate thematic map. Now, the thematic map is not tied to any scenario or anything like that. The thematic map is just something you can activate. Maybe you like it better. Maybe you don't like the cartoony sort of kiddie graphics on this side, and you say, I want it to look realistic. Well, the thematic map is actually geographically correct as well. So the way in which the sand and the mountains and the jungle and the wetlands have been laid out is the way in which these areas would naturally form geographically, which means that it's not really balanced for play because it's balanced for geographical accuracy. You can also see here in the rulebook that the ways in which the island are laid out for a 2, 3, and 4 player game are indicated here. Obviously, in a 1 player game, you just use 1 tile. So, yeah, it's 1 tile per player. And in a 2 player game, you have west next to east. And in a 3 player game, you have northeast on the top there as well. So, just so happens that I have the 3 tiles I need for a 3 player game here. So, there's my west. Here's my east. And finally, here's my northeast. And there we go. We can see that the colors all kind of fit together. We've got a big mountain range here. We've got a big sort of wetlands down the middle here, coming down to the coast. We've got big jungles here and here. And little deserts dotted around as well. It's also worth noting that because you've got a big chunk missing out of the middle here, it's more difficult to move your presence around the board. But if that's too easy for you, you can always add a scenario or an adversary. You can also ratchet up the complexity of your spirits. That's another way to increase the difficulty. Ratcheting up the complexity of the spirits does make it notably harder. The 2 hardest spirits being Ocean's Hungry Grasp and the Bringer of Dreams and Nightmares. Dreams and Nightmares doesn't do any damage to invaders at all. He simply converts all damage he deals into fear, which is very potent, but it means he can quickly become overwhelmed if he's not paired with defensive spirits to help protect the land, or maybe a very offensive spirit like Lightning's Quick Strike, who can nuke down a lot of the invaders while the Bringer of Dreams and Nightmares builds up the fear. So here we've got the adversary board for the Kingdom of Sweden. And the Kingdom of Sweden are actually really, really good at spreading blight. So we can see here there's no additional loss condition, which is great. They've got a stage 2 escalation. So some of your stage 2 cards here have these little tents on them, and or castles or whatever those are. I don't know, man. But those trigger a stage 2 escalation if you're playing with an adversary. So it says here with the Swedish. After invaders explore into each land this phase, if that land has at least as many invaders as Dehaan, replace 1 Dehaan with a town. Well, that's pretty awful because the Dehaan are very, very difficult to replace, and here they are just being taken away and replaced with towns, which we hate. Now, you'll note here that the invader also has a sort of set of difficulty levels. There's 6. And these effects are cumulative. So if you're playing at level 4, you use all of the effects from levels 1 through 4. What you don't do is use the fear cards from the first 3 levels. You use the fear cards for level 4. Remember how we put out 3, 3, 3 between each of the terror levels to create 9 cards? Well, at level 4 on the Kingdom of Sweden, you have 11 fear cards. And this just says 3 on top, then 4 on the bottom. And you've got a whole bunch of different effects that come into play here. They revolve around increasing blight, or doing extra damage, stuff like that. So all really just horrible sort of effects. I'll leave you to discover them all on your own, but each sort of adversary has a different flavor. England, for example, also have this additional loss condition, proud and mighty capital. If there are 7 or more towns and cities, sort of towns or cities or whatever, cumulative in a single land, the invaders win. So England's looking to build a big capital, and actually all of their powers are sort of centered around building and increasing their building strength and the amount of stuff they build. Brandenburg, Prussia are a bit different. They don't have an additional loss condition, and they just sort of add more stuff, and they have more explore cards and more difficult explore cards. They change the number of explore cards in the explore deck. It's worth noting that if you look at your level 3 explore cards here, they actually have 2 regions on them. So when you get to level 3 explore, that's really tough because you've got so many invaders coming out. So better have really developed your spirit powers by the time you get there. Finally, we've got 4 scenarios. These all kind of do different things. Blitz is actually a scenario that doesn't really make the game harder at all. It just makes the game a lot faster. It turns all slow powers into fast powers, and everything else just happens more quickly. So this just changes the fundamental sort of rules of the game. The Dehaan Insurrection makes the Dehaan sort of more mobile and also damaging, so that they'll rove around the island dealing damage to the invaders. However, the invaders retaliate by sending their armies, so you'll get a lot more explorers and buildings and stuff fighting back against the Dehaan. Essentially, this sort of increases the war between the invaders and the Dehaan. You've got the Rituals of Terror. This does away with the sort of standard rules for the Terror deck and introduces a lot more notably difficult rules for managing fear and achieving terror levels. This one's really hard. Finally, we've got Guard the Isle's Heart, which is a sort of a territory control type scenario, which commands you to select lands on the map, and you've got to protect them, and if the invaders get in them and start building buildings, you lose the game. So I think that just about covers it for Spirit Island. I think I've sort of spoken about more or less everything. I didn't go through the scenarios and the invader powers in too much detail, but I'll leave that for you to discover on your own. A few things I would sort of point out is that the order in which you play power cards during the spirit phase can be very powerful, so make sure you're talking to your friends and making sure that you play the cards that trigger off of elements towards the end of your turn, so that you make sure you've played all the cards with the elements you need before you get to those cards that need the elements. It's very helpful as you're planning in the spirit phase to put your money down on the cards that sort of come up. That helps to remind you which cards you're going to play, and maybe there's a cool way to sort of remember the order in which you're going to play them. Finally, I would just say that it's very easy to forget the sort of range of powers and stuff like that, or whether they're fast and slow. So always make sure you sort of keep an eye on whether the power's fast or slow, and also what its range is, particularly with sacred sites. It's easy to forget when you need to have a sacred site out. But the game does, the rulebook does say that, whoops, if you notice you've made a mistake, don't worry about it too much. You've just made the game a little bit easier, a little bit harder for a time. But just start playing with the correct rules and carry on. It's really about having sort of fun and having a good time. So with that in mind, I'm going to be joined by my friend Ollie tomorrow, and we're going to be setting aside our age-old rivalries, ingrained grudges and all that, and we're going to try and collaborate and work together to defend the Spirit Island from the evil invaders. We'll be playing against a level 2 English band, but without a scenario in play, so we'll just be using sort of the standard rules in a level 2 difficulty match. So you can come back and join us tomorrow for the first round of that to see how we do. We'll give you a bit of background, a bit of history about the spirits we're playing, and then we'll dive right in. So I hope you'll come and join us, and if you've enjoyed this video or you want to see more like it, make sure that you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss them, and thank you very much for watching.